I can't believe we made it to the final episode of this thing. That's insane. One of my favorite rabbis, which is a weird way to start any sermon, but I've known a few, not as many as ministers, but one of my favorite rabbis is this rabbi named Zalman Velikin, who I met in Chautauqua, New York. He was a young guy when I met him, in his late 20s, early 30s. I was in my early 20s doing undergraduate study and dreaming of what was going to come next. I was seriously considering going to law school at the time, and I think Rabbi Zalman was a huge influence in keeping my passion about studying God alive. What he'd do is he'd invite me over on Friday nights, right after their Sabbath had begun, and we would sit in his living room, and we would talk sometimes for hours on end. He was a brilliant man. So was his wife. She was actually a religion professor, but he was an Orthodox rabbi, very, very conservative, came out of a Hasidic tradition. And honestly, I've never met anybody in my entire life whose knowledge of Scripture was so deep and vast, or I don't think I met anybody who even came close to paralleling Rabbi Zalman Velikin's knowledge of Hebrew Scripture. The best thing about him, though, the thing that I really liked was when we would be sitting and talking, he would tell these stories when I would ask him a question or he was trying to impart some truth in me. Usually, they all seemed to deal with a rabbi and a student, and they came out of his rabbinic tradition. Like once when we were talking about love, when he'd get into these stories, he'd just lean back in his chair and he'd start petting his beard. He had this huge beard. And he'd start petting it, and he'd give these really obscure stories, like this one where you're talking about love, and he started talking about the story about a rabbi and a student, and the rabbi would go to town preaching, and the student would come along with him as an assistant as he learned. And the rabbi was a very outgoing man, very charismatic, but the student was very shy and timid. And one day as they're walking along, the student just becomes overwhelmed with this feeling that he has for his teacher, this love he has for him. So as they're walking, the student's walking, and he's trying to build up courage, and so he just kind of shouts from behind the rabbi as he's walking behind him. He said, "Rabbi, I love you." And the rabbi kept walking, and the student thought about it, thought it was strange, but rabbi's getting old, a little hard of hearing. So he yells a little louder, hey, Rabbi, I love you." The rabbi just kept walking, just completely ignored him. The student is kind of getting frustrated, and he's getting nervous, and he finally builds his courage up and he yells, "Hey, Rabbi, I said I love you," and the guy still walks. So the student, now completely frustrated, runs up and grabs the rabbi and rolls him around, and he says, "Rabbi, didn't you hear what I said? I said I love you." And the rabbi said, "Yes, I heard you, but do you feel my pain?" I mean, these were the kind of stories that Zalman would tell me, and I'd have to try and make sense out of what in the world he was talking about. One time we were talking about wisdom and how you get wisdom. And Zalman sat back again and started stroking his beard, and he told me this other story about a rabbi and a student. And they were sitting and talking, and the student said, wanted to know how you learned wisdom. He said, how do I get wisdom? And the rabbi said, you don't want to know that. And he goes, "No, I do. How do I gain wisdom? What do I need in order to get wisdom?" And the rabbi, "Oh, you don't need to know that at all." And the student kept insisting. And so the rabbi said, finally, "You want to know how you gain wisdom?" And the student said, "Yes." And he said, "Let's take a walk." So they're walking along, and the rabbi is deflecting all the questions, telling the kid to shut up as he's asking him too many questions on the way. And they come to the river, and the rabbi grabs the student and stops him, and he says, "Are you absolutely sure you want to know how you gain wisdom?" And the student says, "Absolutely, Rabbi." And he goes, "You're sure about this?" And the student said, "Yes." And he goes, "All right, well, come with me." And they walk out into the water until it's about waist deep. The rabbi looks at him again, and he says, "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this, that you want to learn how to gain wisdom?" And the student said, "Absolutely." And so the rabbi grabbed him, and he shoves him under the water. And the student starts struggling, and the rabbi just holds him there under the water until all the fight has gone out of the kid. And then he lets him back up. And the student's looking at the rabbi like, "What? Why did you do that?" And the rabbi said, "What is it that you were thinking about when you were under there? What did you want?" And the student said, "All I could think about and all I wanted was just another breath. I just wanted some air." And the rabbi said, "That's where wisdom begins. You've got to want wisdom in your life as badly as you wanted air." I asked Zalman if he believed that story, not if a rabbi he knew actually took a kid out into the lake and tried to drown him, but if he thought that you needed to want wisdom that badly in order to get it. And I shouldn't have been surprised that a man whose entire life, almost since the time he was born, had been focused on learning his tradition and scriptures and about his faith. And he didn't even hesitate when he said, yes, absolutely. Wisdom is this extremely, extremely important thing and tradition in the Jewish tradition. But I was taken aback by his answer. I guess I never thought that wisdom was something that you could teach or something that you necessarily learned or could want and go after. I always figured wisdom was something that came with time, with living your life and learning from it. Knowledge seems like something that you can learn, but wisdom is something that comes with experience. Like knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in fruit salad, right? Solomon begins his reign a lot like his father David did. Very young and horribly inexperienced. But unlike David, Solomon seems to know that and to recognize that. And so when God asks Solomon what he wants, Solomon asks for wisdom and God gives it to him. And that's how we remember King Solomon. He's called Solomon the Wise. And the kingdom then enters into this time of stability and prosperity like it's never seen before then. The bold and the biblical, the soap opera of Israel might not have begun with David, but it ends with him. Mainly because Solomon had wisdom. Every king before him had asked for things like power or victory over enemies or several other things, but Solomon asked for the wisdom to discern God's will, to do what was best for him and his people in God's eyes. So even with youth and experience, Solomon becomes wise. Maybe Zalman had it right. I mean, maybe you have to want wisdom above anything else. And it isn't always something that comes with time and experience like I thought. I mean, David had time and experience, but I'm not sure I would consider David wise. After all this, after going through all of this, I'm not even sure David learned his lesson. I mean, on David's deathbed, he asked Solomon to do two things: to kill Joab, who was once his trusted friend and advisor, and to kill a man named Shimei. And if you recognize that name, it's because Shimei was the guy who was throwing stones and cursing David as he left Jerusalem, as he was running from his son Absalom. So even after all this time, it seems like David can't let go of all this drama that had just plagued him his entire life. He can't seem to see his own responsibility in what was going on. So did time and experience make David more wise? I'm not necessarily certain it did. It's also interesting that in chapter 3 here, this is the first time we've heard from God in quite some time. God's been awfully quiet until he shows up here in Solomon's dream. And what's interesting is that as God and Solomon are talking, God makes the same request that he's been making all along, since the beginning of the story. God tells Solomon to keep him at the center of things. And that might be the only right thing that David did. And so we end this soap opera almost right where we begin. And God's only desire this whole time seems to be in the center of people's lives, to remain in the forefront or the focus of how people live their lives. And God says the same thing that basically God's been saying this whole time. If you keep me at the heart of what you're doing, then things will go well. Interestingly, in the book of Proverbs, a book about wisdom that's credited to Solomon, it says that fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That wisdom begins with keeping God in the center of our lives. I wish I could go back to those Friday nights with Zalman. sit down with him and ask him more about his parable, about the rabbi who almost drowned his student. And ask him if he feels that this yearning, this struggle, this desire for nothing else but wisdom, if that's really a desire for God or for knowledge of God's will. I mean, could it be that what wisdom really is the ability to discern God's will in any given situation and then move accordingly because we have God at the center of our lives? Solomon becomes this wise king. Even according to records outside of the Bible, people were blown away by his brilliance and wisdom, and they would come from all over the world. Even other rulers would come to seek his advice and gain some wisdom from it. He does things that I don't even think his father David even dreamed of or could imagine. And all throughout his reign, he seems to be keeping God in the center of things. He even builds the great temple for the ark that David wanted to build but wasn't allowed to. People still gather at the foundation of that temple to this day to pray. In the city that his father built but really flourished under Solomon's reign. That city is known as one of, if not the holiest cities on earth. It's considered by billions of people across many different faiths of to be the center of where faith begins, that God is at the center of it. But of course, David leaves that city another legacy too. Drama and fighting and violence and suspicion are all a part of that city's continuing legacy to this day as well. It's amazing that one of the holiest places on earth is also one of the most conflicted and violent places on earth. And it's been that way ever since its inception. Makes you wonder if the two can't be separated. Maybe some wisdom to take away is that faith always comes with conflict. That maybe like the story of the rabbi who nearly drowns his student to show him what a deep yearning for something looks like. Faith and keeping God at the center of things comes with a struggle too, with a conflict. There's always a conflict. After all, David was one of the most conflicted people we could read about. Everyone in this story seems to be, through the whole story, from Eli and his sons, through Saul into David, and now into Solomon, there's this struggle between following God's will and keeping God at the center of things and being lured away by things like power and greed and lust or a desire for revenge. Solomon seems to be the first one that prays for the right things. Solomon asks for wisdom and discernment. Solomon asks for air while struggling under the water. Solomon seeks God's first and God's will for him and his people before anything else. It's amazing that a story about a king and his family from 3,000 years ago can seem so relevant, so relatable, and so understandable today. After all that time, after 3,000 years, we still struggle with the same things. I mean, at least I hope we do. How do we let God lead us instead of ourselves and our own wants and desires? How do we not allow ourselves to be corrupted or brought down by things like power or wealth or lust or revenge? How do we live as a faithful people in a world that sometimes seems to work so hard to destroy that faith? And yet for 3,000 years, God gives us the same answer over and over again. Keep me at the center of things. Focus on me. The soap opera, the bold and the biblical, ends the same way our own journeys begin and end. God calling to us and asking us to keep God in the center of who we are and what we do. And maybe in the end here, after 60 chapters of Scripture about a king who lived 3,000 years ago, maybe at the conclusion of the soap opera, maybe what we walk away with isn't just a better understanding of who David was and why he did the things he did, but maybe we also walk away with the importance of understanding what Solomon's question was here. Maybe like Solomon, we can look at David's life, all the good, all the mistakes, all the faults and flaws of a human, and realize how important it is to keep God as the focal point. Maybe we can walk away more like Solomon, asking for God's wisdom and discernment. Asking ourselves how we use things like our power and our wealth to benefit others, to glorify God. And maybe we can better see how important it is to keep God in the center of all that it is we do and are. Will Solomon live into his title of the wisest king ever to live? Can this new king forge a new legacy for his family and for his kingdom? Will Solomon truly keep God in the center of all things?